The moment I saw his face, I knew this trial was rigged before it even began. Brandon Carter sat at the defense table, his fingers laced together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Across the courtroom, the jury had just filed in, their expressions unreadable, except for the foreman, a middle-aged man with cold blue eyes and a jaw clenched so tight it looked like he was grinding his teeth. Brandon had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who had already made up his mind. His client, Darius Shaw, sat stiffly beside him, dressed in an ill-fitting navy suit Brandon had bought him the night before. He was only 19, a kid, the kind who should have been worrying about his first semester of college, not fighting for his future in a courtroom where the deck was stacked against him. Judge William Harlow sat high on the bench, adjusting his robe with slow, deliberate movements, a relic of an era that refused to die. Harlow had been a fixture in the state's judicial system for decades. He was the kind of judge who didn't even bother hiding his disdain when a black defendant stood before him. He didn't have to. The prosecutor, Thomas Reynard, exuded confidence. A man in his early 40s, sharp-featured, with slicked-back blonde hair. He had built his career on cases like this, cases where the police handed him a neatly wrapped conviction, and all he had to do was tie the bow. He smirked as he caught Brandon's gaze, as if daring him to believe he had a chance. Brandon forced himself to stay calm. He had been in courtrooms like this before. He had seen men like Reynard, judges like Harlow, juries with minds made up before the first witness was called. But this case was different. Darius wasn't guilty. Yes, he had been there. Yes, he had run when the cops showed up, but he hadn't pulled the trigger. The surveillance footage had been grainy, the eyewitness testimony unreliable. There was no forensic evidence. The only thing tying Darius to the crime was a cop's word, and Brandon knew how that played out when the accused was a black teenager from the wrong part of town. The bailiff called the court to order. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Judge Harlow adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the papers before him. "We're here today for the case of the state of Illinois versus Darius Shaw," he intoned. "Mr. Reynard, is the prosecution prepared to present its case?" Reynard rose, buttoning his expensive suit with a slow, deliberate motion. "Yes, Your Honor." Brandon kept his face neutral, but his pulse quickened. The game was beginning, and he was playing with loaded dice. The case against Darius Reynard wasted no time painting Darius as a dangerous criminal. He called his first witness, Officer Scott Langley, a veteran cop with a reputation for making arrests that conveniently never seemed to involve white suspects. Langley took the stand with the ease of a man who knew he had nothing to worry about. "Officer Langley," Reynard began, pacing slowly in front of the jury, "walk us through what happened the night of September 14th. Langley cleared his throat. "We received reports of shots fired at a convenience store on East 47th. When we arrived, we saw multiple suspects fleeing the scene. I pursued the defendant, Darius Shaw. He resisted arrest, attempted to flee, and when we searched him, we found a loaded firearm on his person." Brandon slowly exhaled through his nose. This was what he had expected. Langley wasn't here to tell the truth. He was here to deliver a narrative. "Was the firearm registered to the defendant?" Reynard asked. "No, sir. It was an illegal firearm." Reynard turned to the jury. "An illegal firearm, ladies and gentlemen. And tell me, Officer Langley, was there gunshot residue found on Mr. Shaw's hands?" There was. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reynard let it sit for a moment before continuing. "Would you say that Mr. Shaw posed a threat to public safety?" Brandon shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That's speculation." Judge Harlow barely glanced in his direction. "Overruled." Langley nodded. "In my professional opinion, absolutely." Reynard turned back to the jury, his voice lowering as if he were sharing a dangerous secret. There you have it, an unregistered firearm, gunshot residue, a suspect fleeing the scene. You tell me, does that sound like an innocent man? Brandon clenched his jaw. This was the kind of showmanship that got innocent kids locked away for decades. He had seen this tactic before. Present half-truths as full evidence, create an emotional reaction in the jury, and let bias do the rest. But he wasn't going to let them get away with it. Cross-examination. Brandon rose from his seat, adjusting his tie as he stepped toward the witness stand. He took his time, letting the silence stretch before speaking. "Officer Langley," he said smoothly, "you testified that my client was in possession of a firearm. Did you personally witness him using it?" Langley shifted slightly. "No, but did you personally see my client at the exact moment the shooting occurred?" Langley hesitated. "No." Brandon nodded as if he had expected this answer. "So, to be clear, you did not see him fire the weapon. You did not see him at the exact moment of the shooting. Yet you arrested him? Why?" Langley's jaw tightened. He matched the description given by a witness. Brandon stepped closer. A witness who, if I recall correctly, described the suspect as a black male in a hoodie. That's it? Langley's expression hardened. That was the description. Yes, Brandon let that settle over the jury. "Officer Langley, how many black men in hoodies do you think were in that neighborhood that night?" Reynard stood. "Objection. Sustained," Judge Harlow cut in. Brandon smirked. The judge could shut him down all he wanted, but the jury had heard the question. The seed had been planted. He turned back to Langley. "Tell me, officer, how long after arriving on the scene did you arrest my client?" Langley hesitated. "A few minutes." "Just a few minutes?" Brandon raised an eyebrow. "And in those few minutes, you thoroughly examined all possible suspects, reviewed the security footage, and confirmed beyond a doubt that Darius Shaw was the shooter?" Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. "We made the best decision with the information we had at the time." Brandon nodded slowly, turning toward the jury. "You made a decision, Officer Langley. Whether it was the right one is up to them." He returned to his seat, heart pounding. He had scored points, but this was just the opening act. Reynard was already preparing his next move, and Brandon knew one thing for certain. This trial was only going to get uglier. Brandon Carter sat back in his chair, resisting the urge to glance at the jury. He had landed a few blows against Langley, but he knew better than to get comfortable. This trial wasn't about facts. It wasn't about evidence. It was about perception. Who looked guilty? Who sounded believable? Who the jury wanted to see as the villain? And right now, Darius Shaw was losing that battle. Across the courtroom, Renard moved with the confidence of a man who had never known struggle. He had a way of making the prosecution's case seem inevitable, as if the trial was just a formality before Darius was led away in shackles. The jurors weren't looking at facts anymore. They were watching a performance, and Renard, he was the star of the show. Brandon tapped his pen against his notepad, forcing himself to think 3 steps ahead. He needed to shift the narrative. The prosecution's case was built on 3 things: Langley's testimony, the supposed gunshot residue, and the eyewitness. If Brandon could dismantle even one of those pillars, the whole structure might come crashing down. His chance came sooner than expected. The witness. Prosecution calls Mrs. Linda Halpert to the stand, Reynard announced. A middle-aged woman in a gray cardigan shuffled to the witness stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. Brandon recognized the type, an uncertain witness, someone who wasn't used to testifying, but had been convinced that they saw something, or at least convinced that they needed to. Reynard gave her a reassuring smile. "Mrs. Halpert, do you recall the night of September 14th? "Yes," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Could you tell the court what you saw?" She hesitated, then cleared her throat. "I was in my car, parked outside the store. I heard a gunshot, and then I saw someone running." Reynard leaned in slightly. "And do you see that person in this courtroom today?" A pause, a hesitation, and then her eyes flicked to Darius. Horror flashed across Darius's face. "I wasn't even—" Brandon placed a firm hand on his shoulder, silencing him. Now wasn't the time. "There," Mrs. Halpert said, pointing. "That's him." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Reynard turned to the jury with a look of quiet satisfaction. No further questions. Brandon rose, smoothing his tie. He walked toward the witness stand at an unhurried pace, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Mrs. Halpert," he said gently, "I appreciate you being here today. It's not easy to testify in a trial like this." She nodded, wringing her hands. "You said you saw someone running. Can you describe them?" "Well, it was dark," she hesitated. "But I remember he was wearing dark clothes. A hoodie." "A hoodie," Brandon repeated. "Anything else? Height, weight, distinguishing features?" Her brow furrowed. "I don't know. It all happened so fast." Brandon nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "Of course. A gunshot. Panic. Someone running? It would be hard to get a clear look, wouldn't it?" She hesitated, then nodded. Brandon turned slightly, glancing at the jury. "Mrs. Halpert, how far away were you when you saw this person?" Maybe 20 feet?" 20 feet. And you were sitting in your car?" "Yes." Brandon took a slow step closer. "And was your car's windshield clean?" She blinked. What?" "Your windshield," Brandon repeated. "Was it dirty, streaked, maybe a little foggy from the night air?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Brandon pressed on. "Mrs. Halpert, how well do you think anyone could identify a person in the dark through a car windshield from 20 feet away?" A tense silence. Reynard's jaw clenched. Mrs. Halpert shifted in her seat. I was sure at the time, but..." Brandon gave her a kind smile. "Memory is tricky, isn't it?" She nodded weakly. Brandon turned to the judge. No further questions. The firearms expert, Brandon, had barely returned to his seat when Renard was already calling his next witness. "The prosecution calls Mr. Alan Trask, firearms expert." A stocky man in a tweed jacket took the stand. He had the look of someone who enjoyed testifying, someone who had done it many times before. "Mr. Trask," Renard began, "can you confirm that the firearm found on Mr. Shaw had been fired recently?" Trask nodded. "Yes. Based on the presence of gunshot residue, I can say with a high degree of certainty that the weapon was discharged shortly before Mr. Shaw's arrest." Renard turned toward the jury. "There you have it. The gun was fired, and it was found on the defendant. Simple, isn't it?" Brandon sighed inwardly. "Here we go." "Defense may cross-examine," Judge Harlow said. Brandon stood. "Mr. Trask, gunshot residue. How does someone get it on their hands?" "By firing a gun," Trask replied. Brandon raised an eyebrow. "Only by firing a gun?" Trask hesitated. "Well, also by handling a recently fired weapon, or by being near one when it's discharged." Brandon nodded. "So if someone was, say, in close proximity to a shooting, but never actually pulled the trigger, they could have gunshot residue on them?" "Yes, that's possible." Brandon let the words hang in the air. Then he turned to the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Darius fired that gun, but what they haven't told you is that there were multiple people at that scene. That gun changed hands more than once. And yet, The only person they tested for residue? The only person they arrested? He gestured toward Darius, a black teenager. Silence fell over the courtroom. Brandon locked eyes with Reynard. He had drawn blood, but the fight wasn't over yet. The judge's warning. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Brandon gathered his papers, preparing for the next round. But before he could leave, Judge Harlow's voice stopped him. "Mr. Carter, a word." Brandon turned. The judge's expression was unreadable. "You're walking a fine line," Harlow said, voice low. "I suggest you tread carefully." Brandon forced a polite smile. "I'm just doing my job, Your Honor." Harlow's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to follow the rules, and in my courtroom, I decide what those rules are." A chill settled in Brandon's gut. This wasn't just about the case. Harlow was making something clear. No matter how well Brandon played, the game was rigged, and if he pushed too hard, there would be consequences. Brandon swallowed the anger rising in his throat. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. Brandon Carter leaned against the courthouse sink, gripping the edges so tight his fingers ached. The faucet dripped, a slow, rhythmic tap that filled the silence as he tried to steady his breathing. Judge Harlow's words echoed in his head. "In my courtroom, I decide what the rules are." Brandon had seen this before, a warning, veiled as legal authority, a message. Stay in your lane. Don't push too hard. He splashed cold water on his face, letting the sting pull him back into focus. He didn't have time for anger. He had a case to win. He dried his hands, straightened his tie, and walked out of the restroom. Darius was waiting for him in the hallway, his hands stuffed into his suit pockets, his face drawn. "They're gonna find me guilty, aren't they?" Darius said, his voice flat. Brandon studied him. He saw the exhaustion, the hopelessness creeping in. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Brandon replied. Darius scoffed. "Man, look at that jury. Look at the judge. They don't care about me." Brandon exhaled. He couldn't lie to him. The system wasn't built for kids like Darius to walk free. But that didn't mean he would let it win. "You trust me?" Brandon asked. Darius hesitated, then nodded. "Then hold on a little longer," Brandon said. "We're not done yet." The trap is set. Back in the courtroom, Reynard took the floor again. His confidence had barely wavered, but there was a slight shift in his demeanor, a cautiousness Brandon hadn't seen before. Brandon had rattled him. And he intended to keep doing it. Reynard called his final witness, Detective Mark Hensley, a seasoned investigator with 20 years on the force. Hensley had the look of a man who had testified more times than he could count. His expression was calm, composed. He wasn't here to make mistakes. "Detective Hensley," Reynard began, "tell us about your role in this case." Hensley folded his hands neatly in front of him. "I was assigned to investigate the shooting at the convenience store on East 47th. We reviewed security footage, gathered witness statements, and arrested the suspect based on the evidence collected." Reynard nodded. "And was there any doubt in your mind that Darius Shaw was the shooter?" "None whatsoever," Hensley replied. Brandon didn't blink. He had been waiting for this moment. "Defense may cross-examine," Judge Harlow announced. Brandon rose slowly, walking toward the witness stand with measured steps. "Detective Hensley," he said, his tone calm. "You reviewed the security footage, correct?" "Correct." "And does that footage clearly show my client firing a weapon?" Hensley hesitated. A fraction of a second, but enough. "The footage shows a man in dark clothing fleeing the scene," Hensley said carefully. Brandon tilted his head. "So, no, it does not clearly show Darius Shaw firing a weapon." Hensley's jaw tightened. "It matches his description." Brandon turned to the jury. And that description was what exactly? A black male in a hoodie. Brandon let the words sit for a moment before speaking again. Detective, how many black males in hoodies were in that area that night? Hensley shifted in his seat. I couldn't say. Brandon took another step forward. Let's talk about the gun found on my client. You say it was the murder weapon? Yes. Brandon nodded. And where was it found? Hensley paused. In a dumpster near the scene. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Brandon didn't let up. Near the scene, not on my client? Hensley exhaled. No. Brandon turned, pacing slightly in front of the jury. So, just to summarize, you did not see my client fire a weapon. You did not find a gun on him. And the only real evidence tying him to this crime is an unreliable witness and a cop's word? Hensley clenched his jaw. The evidence speaks for itself. Brandon faced the jury. Yeah, it does. He returned to his seat. And for the first time, Reynard didn't look quite so smug. A dangerous offer. As court adjourned for the day, Brandon barely made it to his office before his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered. Carter. A familiar voice chuckled. You're making my job difficult, Brandon. Reynard. Brandon's grip tightened around the phone. Something on your mind, counselor? A pause. Then Reynard spoke casually, as if discussing the weather. You're a smart guy. You know how this ends. Brandon's pulse ticked up. That a threat? A reality check. Reynard replied. Look, we both know the judge isn't on your side. The jury? They've already decided. You can fight all you want, but we both know how this plays out. Brandon leaned back in his chair. So what's your point? A beat of silence. Then, take the deal. Brandon sat up. What deal? Reynard's voice lowered. 15 years. Plead out. No life sentence, no death row. Your client gets to see daylight again. Brandon's jaw clenched. 15 years for a crime he didn't commit? Reynard sighed. Come on, Brandon. Be smart. If this goes to verdict, he's finished. You know that. Brandon's throat tightened. He did know that. The trial wasn't about innocence. It was about who the system wanted to punish. And if the jury ruled against Darius, there would be no appeals. No second chances, he exhaled. I'll think about it. Reynard chuckled. Don't take too long. The line went dead. Brandon set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. He had spent his entire career fighting to change the system. But what if the system was too broken to beat? The choice. That night, Brandon met Darius in the holding cell. The kid sat on the edge of the cot, hands clasped together, staring at the floor. He looked up as Brandon walked in. You got something for me? Darius asked. Brandon hesitated. Then, they offered you a deal, 15 years. Darius let out a sharp laugh. 15? Man, I didn't do anything. Brandon sat beside him. I know. Darius shook his head. So what do we do? Brandon sighed. We fight, but you need to know. This judge, this jury, it's not fair, Darius. It never was. Darius stared at him, then spoke softly. You think we can win? Brandon met his gaze. I think we have to try. Darius inhaled deeply, then nodded. Then let's go all the way. Brandon patted his shoulder. All right. No deals, no surrender. If the system wanted to break them, it would have to do it the hard way. Brandon Carter had been in enough courtrooms to recognize when the walls were closing in. And right now, that was exactly what was happening. Judge Harlow's gavel slammed down as the courtroom came to order. The jury was back. The prosecution had played its hand, stacking the case against Darius Shaw with half-truths and circumstantial evidence. Now, it was Brandon's turn to dismantle it. But first, He had a witness to call. The informant, Brandon, rose from his chair. Your Honor, the defense calls Officer Jeremy Vance to the stand. A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. Reynard turned in his seat, eyes narrowing slightly. This wasn't part of his script. A moment later, Officer Vance, a man in his early 40s with a nervous energy about him, walked to the stand. He avoided eye contact with Reynard as he sat down. That was a good sign. Brandon approached. Officer Vance, you were working the night of September 14th, correct? Vance swallowed. Yes. And you were assigned to patrol the area where the shooting took place? Yes. Brandon paced slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for tension to build. Were you one of the officers who responded to the scene? Vance hesitated. No, I was nearby. Brandon raised an eyebrow. Nearby? Meaning? Vance shifted uncomfortably. I was a few blocks away. Brandon nodded as if that made perfect sense. So, when the report came in about the shooting, you weren't the first to respond. Who was? Vance hesitated. Brandon pushed. Detective Mark Hensley, correct? A muscle in Vance's jaw twitched. Yes. Brandon allowed himself a slow, deliberate breath. He had spent the past 2 nights digging, pulling strings, making calls. And what he had found? It was exactly what he needed. Officer Vance, he said, before this trial, did you provide my office with a statement regarding certain irregularities in the investigation? Reynard shot up. Objection. Relevance? Brandon turned, keeping his expression calm. Your Honor, if the prosecution is relying on an investigation to convict my client, the credibility of that investigation is very much relevant. Judge Harlow hesitated. For a moment, Brandon thought he might shut him down completely. Then, proceed carefully, Mr. Carter. Brandon faced Vance. Officer, you stated that you were a few blocks away when the shooting occurred. But according to your report, Detective Hensley radioed in about a suspect before you even reached the scene. Is that correct? Vance's Adam's apple bobbed. Yes. Brandon turned to the jury. To be clear, before any forensic evidence was collected, before any witness statements were taken, before anyone had a full picture of what happened, Detective Hensley had already identified a suspect. Yes. Another murmur spread through the courtroom. Brandon leaned in. Did Detective Hensley say why? Vance hesitated. Brandon let the silence sit. Then, softly, Officer, you're under oath. Vance exhaled. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, It's one of them. A sharp stillness filled the room. Brandon's expression didn't change, but inside, his pulse thundered. He turned to the jury. One of them. Not a name, not a description tied to any evidence, just a vague, sweeping assumption. Reynard was on his feet. Objection. This is pure speculation. Brandon turned. Your Honor, this isn't speculation. It's testimony. Testimony that calls into question the very foundation of this case. Judge Harlow looked furious, but after a long pause, he sighed. Objection overruled. Brandon turned back to Vance. Officer, were there any reports of another suspect that night? Any other possible leads? Vance looked miserable. Yes. Brandon feigned surprise. Really? And were those leads investigated? Vance shook his head. No. Brandon let that settle. Then, with finality, no further questions. The system strikes back. The prosecution scrambled to recover. Reynard tried to downplay Vance's testimony, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it. They had felt it. But Brandon knew better than to celebrate. The system didn't like being exposed, and it always had a way of pushing back. That night, as Brandon packed up his briefcase, his office door swung open. Judge Harlow stood in the doorway. Brandon slowly set down his papers. Your Honor. Harlow stepped inside, closing the door behind him. You think you're clever, Carter? The judge asked. Brandon folded his arms. I think I'm doing my job. Harlow smiled coldly. Your job is to play within the system, not to tear it apart. Brandon felt his jaw clench. Funny. I thought my job was to make sure an innocent man doesn't spend the rest of his life behind bars. Harlow stepped closer. You should have taken the deal, Carter. Brandon stared at him. You knew about it. Harlow didn't deny it. Brandon exhaled, shaking his head. This was decided before we even set foot in that courtroom, wasn't it? Harlow's smile didn't fade. The system has its way of keeping order. Brandon laughed dryly. Yeah, long as people like me know our place, right? Harlow's expression hardened. Watch yourself, counselor. Brandon met his gaze. No, you watch yourself. For the first time, something flickered behind Harlow's eyes. A warning, maybe even a threat. Then he turned and walked out. Brandon sat down, rubbing his temples. They were running out of time. The jury deliberates. The next morning, closing arguments began. Reynard stuck to his script, painting Darius as a dangerous young man, a product of his environment. Brandon, on the other hand, made it simple. There are two versions of this case, he told the jury. One is built on assumption. The other is built on truth. If you believe in facts, in fairness, in real justice, you know what to do. Then, the jury left to deliberate. Minutes turned to hours. Hours turned to a full day. By the next morning, Brandon sat beside Darius in the courtroom, heart pounding as the jury filed back in. The foreman stood. Your Honor, we have reached a verdict. Brandon clenched his fists beneath the table. Judge Harlow nodded. Proceed. The foreman glanced at the paper in his hands. In the case of the state versus Darius Shaw, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant. A pause. Brandon held his breath. Not guilty. A wave of relief crashed over him. Darius sucked in a sharp breath, his hands shaking. He turned to Brandon, eyes wide. We won? Brandon nodded, barely containing his emotion. Yeah, we won. The aftermath. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. People cheered. Brandon stood with Darius and his mother, shielding them as best he could. Reynard passed by, his face unreadable. Enjoy your win, Carter. Brandon smirked. Oh, I will. As Reynard walked away, Judge Harlow's words echoed in his mind. The system has its way of keeping order. Brandon exhaled. The battle was won. But the war? That was just beginning. Brandon Carter had won. But victories in courtrooms like these didn't come without consequences. The headlines were everywhere. Darius Shaw acquitted. Defense exposes flaws in investigation. Shock verdict in high-profile murder case. Justice served or system manipulated. Brandon knew what was coming before it even arrived. The system didn't like being embarrassed, and it never forgot the people who forced it to change. The fallout begins. Brandon sat in his office, scanning his inbox. Suspiciously high number of emails marked urgent. A few from prospective clients, but most hate mail. The subject lines said it all. You let a killer walk free. Hope your career burns. Maybe next time it'll be someone you love. Brandon had dealt with this before, but this time it was different. The phone rang. He let it go to voicemail. He was tired. For 3 weeks, he had fought a case where the odds were stacked against him, and he had won. But instead of relief, all he felt was exhaustion. A knock on his door. He turned. James Lawson, his mentor, former professor, and one of the few people Brandon still trusted, stood in the doorway. You look like hell, Lawson said. Brandon chuckled dryly. You always know how to make a man feel good. Lawson stepped inside, closing the door. You did something big, Brandon. Brandon sighed, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, doesn't feel like it. Lawson studied him for a moment. Then, they're coming for you. Brandon frowned. Who? Lawson didn't blink. The bar, the DA's office, maybe more. Brandon sat up. You serious? Lawson nodded. They're looking for any angle they can find to discredit you. Brandon exhaled sharply. For what? Winning? Lawson shook his head. For making them look bad. Brandon's jaw clenched. He had seen it happen before. Black attorneys who fought too hard, spoke too loud, and made the wrong enemies. Some lost cases. Some lost careers. Some lost more than that. A warning from the judge. The next morning, Brandon arrived at the courthouse for a separate case, but as he walked in, a familiar voice called out, Carter. He turned. Judge Harlow stood by the elevators, watching him with an unreadable expression. Brandon forced a smile. Good morning, Your Honor. Harlow stepped closer. I warned you. Brandon's smile faded. The judge's voice dropped lower. You think you won something? You think this changes anything? Brandon met his gaze. I think I did my job. Harlow shook his head. You made enemies, and you're not as untouchable as you think. Brandon exhaled, his pulse steady. You don't scare me. Harlow smirked. You should be scared of the ones you don't see coming. The elevator doors opened. The judge stepped inside, leaving Brandon standing there, jaw tight, mind racing. The system never lost gracefully. Retaliation. 2 days later, it started. First, Brandon's firm received an anonymous complaint questioning his conduct in the Darius Shaw case. Then, a well-timed review of his finances appeared in local media, insinuating misconduct, nothing solid, just enough to plant doubt. And then, the worst blow. His next case, a civil rights lawsuit against the police department, was suddenly pulled from his docket. Brandon stormed into his managing partner's office. You're taking me off the case? Samuel Wexler, an older white man with decades of experience, sighed. Brandon, it's not up to me. Brandon's hands clenched into fists. The hell it isn't! Wexler gestured toward a stack of papers on his desk. The firm is under scrutiny. We can't afford the heat right now. Brandon laughed, shaking his head. So that's it? They push and we fold? Wexler met his gaze. This isn't about winning one case. It's about surviving long enough to fight the next one. Brandon exhaled sharply. You're cutting me out. Wexler hesitated. Then, I'm giving you an option. Brandon's stomach tightened. What option? Wexler slid a folder across the desk. Take a leave of absence. Let things cool down. Brandon stared at the folder. He knew what this was. A quiet way to push him out. He met Wexler's eyes. If I say no, Wexler sighed, then you'll find yourself fighting battles you can't win. Brandon grabbed the folder, walked to the door, seen. Then, without turning back, he said, I don't need your protection, and left. Underscore the next fight. That night, Brandon sat alone in his apartment, staring at his whiskey glass. The system was pushing back, hard. His phone buzzed. A text from Darius. You good? Brandon exhaled, smiled slightly. The kid had been through hell, and he was checking in on him. Brandon texted back, always. Then, another buzz, this time from an unknown number. Brandon hesitated before answering. A voice, calm and measured, spoke. Mr. Carter. Brandon straightened. Who's this? A pause. Then, someone who thinks you're just getting started. Brandon frowned. Excuse me? The voice continued. You rattled the system. Now you have a choice. You can take your leave of absence, fade into the background, or you can keep fighting. Brandon's pulse ticked up. And who exactly are you? The voice chuckled. Let's just say, we're people who believe in what you're doing. Brandon glanced out the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. The war wasn't over. It was just changing shape, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't fighting it alone.